All right. So, hey, Colby, welcome back to the show. I see you brought your partner here, David. It's good to meet you, David.
Hey guys, Tony, thanks for the invitation. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you. So, I guess before we start, you want to share a little bit about yourself, David? And I mean, everybody knows Colby by now.
Yeah,
What's it
for
like?
sure. Thanks, Tony. So, I have like 12 or more years of experience in intelligence operations, working for the federal government in sensitive units, international units, and also for the private sector. A lot of operations from the strategic side of things to the tactical side of things. So I love to also do martial arts, workout,
Oh, nice.
outdoors, those type of stuff. Read a lot of books. Kind of what I do right now.
Yeah, what kind of martial arts?
Well, so I started here in Mexico City with full contact. A
Okay.
lot of boxing that is typical here for Mexicans and some Latinos. Uh, I did a kempo with some
Uh-huh.
Japanese teacher. That was nice, and a little bit of jiu-jitsu. So
Okay.
yeah,
We'll have to get a roll in here with Colby
of course,
someday.
great.
Mr. Black Belt here.
Yeah,
Well, David and I rolled, and he'll chew your ankle off. I'll give him
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
he's a monster. Like
Yeah.
Kobe's a monster. No way
Uh,
out.
yeah.
Well, yeah, it's great to see you guys. I mean, so a lot. There's a lot of talk about the border these days. Can you guys share, your perspective on that and kind of what's going on,
Yeah.
and see what's what, because there's a lot of news around it, and be good to hear from your perspective on what's going on.
Yeah, that's a deep question. David and I know you and I have discussed offline, is just that how important the southern border, the U.S. border, is with regard to the geopolitics and the national security of the United States, but perhaps more specifically to an upcoming election or two, because I don't know if David said, but he's Mexican and has worked on the Mexican side of things, and so there's like 3 billion people are going to the polls this year, and so and a lot of those are in Latin America, and so yeah, we
And David, you live in Mexico, right?
Yeah, Mexico City.
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, and so yeah, we've had a lot of questions recently about the border, both from a supply chain perspective, obviously a security perspective, from the perspective of the election and how big of a piece of the election. I mean, the border could end up being, if not the primary election motivation, one of them. And so, David and I have some unique experiences there on the border. David's background is also human rights, which is human rights in Mexico for the federal government is something else. And so we've really, he and I have been having these discussions for quite a while. And so, yeah, if you want me to keep going, and maybe David can talk, but what we plan to do is, guys, we'd like to lay out kind of like, the geopolitical perspective of the border of that region and what it is. And then, from our perspective, we'll just approach this conversation like we're talking to someone who needs to make a decision maker, who needs to make unbiased decisions, whether it's nearshoring supply chains or what have you, and really try to add to the conversation about the border that is becoming, or is already, so extremely political in this country and also Mexico as well.
Yeah.
And really, we plan to probably piss off people on both sides of the political aisle. And so that's our job, in the sense that what we want to do is give as unbiased, unvarnished opinion as possible when it's an opinion, and analytical fact when possible, to really kind of give a more secure foundation for decision makers. So, yeah, that's got to get us started. David, what do you think, man?
Well, so from my perception, this conversation about borders, it's an historical matter. But right now, I think we are facing a lot of things ongoing in the case of Mexico, of course, with our neighbor U.S., and at the south part of our border, we have our own issues too, because when you are talking about not only migration for the people that it's moving from location to location, even if they are moving inside Mexico, or transition migration, that it's the people that it's going through Mexico to arrive to another country. And also we have forced displacements. That is the people that, as the name said, is forced to move, right? It's because of violence, because something is pushing them, because the resources on their side, on their country, on their location are not enough for them. So those scenarios and those changing matters right now are like creating, it's like a pressure, like a pressure for everyone on the political side, on the commercial side. We have a lot of technology integrating in these days. So I think to understand, borders are a monster and always are there, right? But they are changing constantly. So if you are talking about, for example, every time authorities from both countries, I'm talking about Mexico and the US, are trying to implement or to issue some laws or to reinforce the borders, they face, I think it's part of the same stuff, right? Because a lot of criminal organizations are one step ahead, right? So they are not only trying to continue smuggling illegal drugs, for example, or international human trafficking, etc. But they are just trying to also take advantage of certain situations and business, like water, for example. Like they are trying to be involved in any type of business that they can earn, and they can earn to continue having this financial status and power, and not only in Mexico, but in the whole continent and in other continents. So I think it's a discussion that it can be separated in several issues. One is the political side, the other one is the security side, and the other one is the commercial side. So from my perspective and experience, those are like the scenarios that we can split, and we can go through them to understand more what's happening, right? Because Colby mentioned right now the U.S. is going to face elections in 2024. Mexico is on the same side. Mexico is going to elections in 2024, and it's a very sensitive matter, because right now we are facing a lot of violence, more than any other times. Where's
the violence coming from?
Like, sorry, can you repeat that?
So where's the violence coming from, if we start there, right? Because what I'm understanding you say is that the migrants come in to Mexico from other border countries, and then from there they navigate their way up to the U.S. So is Mexico, am I hearing that Mexico is dealing with the same influx? Is just that they make it all the way up to the U.S. border, but they started somewhere in Mexico on a Mexican border that borders another country, and then from there there's violence on that part, and then all the way up to when they reach the U.S.
Exactly. Yeah. So in the south border of Mexico, we have Guatemala, right? So the migrants that came from there, they are sometimes in a lot of percentage, their final goal is to get into the U.S., right? A lot of other nationalities, like for example, people from Haiti, or we are talking about Venezuela. A lot of them are trying to get to Mexico just to improve their situation, right? A lot of them are victims of violence in their road to the U.S. or Mexico because the cartels are trying to co-opt them so they can have hitmen working for them, right? And those are the perfect type of persons that they would like to approach because they are not protected, right? They are on their way in an illegal situation, a lot of them, and they are trying to get into the U.S. As I mentioned, it's a lot of times it's due to the violence that they live in their country or to improve their situation, right? So that's part of some of them stays in Mexico. Those are the few. The higher percentage is their objective is to get into the U.S.
Mm-hmm. And they just kind of let them go all the way up there. Is that what I'm hearing, or there's just some logistical routes that are not privy to the government?
Well, so there are several. In fact, there is a migrant caravan. The name in Spanish is Caravana Migrante. Each year, those migrants are crossing Mexico. They are in a very large group, so they can protect themselves. But their nationalities vary, right? So they can come from Guatemala, they can come from other countries, El Salvador, etc. So for that instance, they are trying to protect themselves to go into the U.S. or to stay in Mexico.
Yeah, I think one thing we want to kind of separate, because Tony, you're asking the right questions, and the real question, like who's migrating right now, and we're seeing a lot of change in flows. In fact, last year I think was the first year. It's only 51%, so it's a majority, a slim one. But you've seen other than Northern Triangle, so Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Mexicans actually crossing the border. You're seeing huge influxes of Cubans, Venezuelans, Haitians, and now more and more from China, from India, I think that kind of leads to the geopolitical perspective of the U.S. border. And really what, you have to understand is, borders, as we define them, are social and political constructs, right? They're not geopolitical reality. The border is something that we as people, as a country, said that's where the line is, and then we enforce that line through, violence, and that became the line. But that line is arbitrary in some sense and also made up. And so the geopolitical kind of reality is a territory of this continent that has, as David mentioned, history. It's a historical conversation. So a lot of times you need to separate kind of even Mexican migrations to the U.S. for work and so forth with other nationalities. So really just understanding the border as a geopolitical reality, where the people, the cultures are intermixed. Myself being from Texas, I actually, the word in the family is I actually have, my family's been in Texas since the beginning. And so we have Mexican blood, for example. Apparently I have a great grandmother from Jalisco. And so, I grew up, speaking Spanish somewhat, grew up in a Latino area. And it was always clear, at least in the Houston area, that culturally it is an integrated environment from there all the way down really into South Texas. And so really kind of understanding, that the U.S.-Mexico border, it's not just a line between these two countries, it's this dynamic frontier where strategic interests, domestic and international interests, they all intersect and interact. So as David said, the economy of the border and what it means to divide that border physically, you have massive economic engagements, cultural engagement, social engagements.
There's a lot of factories along the border, right? So and I think more and more the U.S.-Mexico relationship is going to be even bigger as globalization decouples.
Absolutely. I think that's sometimes lost, is just how big of an economy Mexico is, and what a potential powerful player it is in the future. They have a lot of not as great of a geography as the United States, which is the preeminent geography. but it has a good one. And as they like to say, that it's both a blessing and a curse to be a border country with the United States of America. And so it's really, you think about the geographic continuity of the Mexican-U.S. border, and there are no impassable geographic barriers. I mean, the mountains can be tough and outside of Tucson and the Sonora Desert, and we'll get into all of how, if we get into how the border is policed, that all plays a part. It definitely makes it more difficult. But there's not like the Himalayas keeping you from getting from one country to the other. And so the social connections on both sides of the border are complete. It is a one culture, one geography with obviously Mexican aspects, or you hear Tejano aspects, or even with the language, you have Spanglish, and then that sort of thing. But overall, it's easier to look at that border as one geographic landmass and then separate into a political and social environment with a border. I think if you approach it like that as a decision maker, you can really start to understand the difficulties that are coming, because the migrants are not going to stop coming. That is only going to increase. And so, how are you going to protect the nation, protect the southern border, and all of that, while also understanding just how important that relationship and that physical freedom of movement is for not just people, but for service products and all of the things,
services. Yeah. So I guess, if we say the word, you say the word protect, right? If these people are coming from a place where they're looking for protection, I mean, what protections does the Mexico side provide for these people in order for them to say, hey, maybe, we got all these factories, maybe you come work over here instead of fully crossing the border over to America? Like, is that kind of conversation going on? And
so imagine what's their situation, that they prefer to challenge that security. I'm like putting security in, like, not that they are having security. So their situation is not good. So they prefer to challenge that to get into Mexico, because they think they are going to get better results here, So it's all about also the situation. Sometimes, for example, for Central America and other southern countries, they prefer to get to Mexico and have a job here, right? And maybe just challenge that, because in their country they don't have anything. So, for example, if when Venezuela had a big crisis, like, a lot of people was willing to travel anywhere else rather to stay there, because they were lacking a lot of stuff, like basic stuff, like food, health, supplies, etc. So their situation is very bad. So they prefer to challenge that. The one issue here is we always want, for example, and I'm saying that as a Mexican, like we want always our nationals to be protected when they are crossing into the U.S., right? But it's like a coin toss, because in the southern border, it's like an open space. If you go there, it's like there's a lot of lack of security to cross, right? It's the geopolitical scenario there and the geographic matters. Specifically, you are facing large walks, a lot of kilometers there in the jungle. So it's not easy, and there's a lot of corruption also in federal authorities, in police, militaries are one of the most trusted security bodies here in Mexico. But at the end, it's kind of what's their actual situation, that they prefer to challenge that and to go with their families, even if they are going to be threatened in their road to Mexico or the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of times Americans don't understand, is Mexico has their own illegal immigration problem. And there, as David said, there are two kind of flows, and there's a lot of overlap. There's those that say, I'm going to America and the United States, and that's it. There are those that saying, I am looking for the best opportunity for me and my family, wherever it is.
Yeah.
Right. And so you kind of get those flows. And then you have others that, look, even when Venezuela really started to bleed people as people started to leave, Colombia, they have actually a pretty good program for accepting Venezuelans for work programs and so forth. And so, yeah, I think there's this always understanding that, like, even with like Title 42 is that we could just send people back to Mexico and they would stay there and then wait for an appointment and all that. The problem is those people are sitting in Mexico. Well, they start to look for jobs. They start to challenge the Mexicans who also want those jobs. And then the entire economies that are built up in order to either service or take advantage of a migrant. And to the question of, like, for me, part of my history is that I was in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, but primarily Guatemala for a long time, and the non-profit development, conflict zone development stuff. And I've actually made quite a bit of the route from and multiple attempts from Guatemala up to the U.S. And I would break off if I ever put the people in danger, which happened, quite frankly, where I was actually more of a threat than anything. But what you got to realize is those well-worn paths, they start a lot of times in some room in, Nabá, Guatemala, up in the highlands, where people are being told, like, here's a map, here's how you do it. It's, they're being, whether or not we're sending the message that you can't cross the border, that's not what they're being told. They're being told you absolutely can.
And then opportunity awaits you. It's like a treasure hunt.
And so you got to understand, those people that decide to come, a Guatemalan that decides to come, he gets, let's say, a single male, he gets dressed up in his nicest clothes, he gets on a bus because he wants to take a bus or some sort of motorized vehicle for as long as he can, right? And so what you don't realize is, as soon as that bus takes off from Guatemala City, police are pulling that bus over. They're pulling the guys in the back dressed in their best. They're pulling them off. They're taking a little bit of the money they have in the pocket because they all know they have cash. They'll pull them off the buses. The bus will leave. They'll catch back up with the buses, let you back on. That's just, and that goes, who can make money off of this human being from that moment until they're through and legitimately wherever they, hopefully a job that they had planned. But the question is, the question you really need to ask is, how many different ways could you make money on that person? Right. So one thing is, you can make money on cocaine one time. Someone snorts it and it's gone. You can make money on a human being over and over and over again. The profit margins may be lower. It's not as much, but it is literally a renewable resource. And so Mexico has to get to the question, answer the question, Mexico has a tremendous problem right now that they have to negotiate on how to manage these flows in their own country, because a large influx of illegal immigrants can destabilize economies and countries, and that's historically been the truth. So it's really important to understand just how those flows are at this point, these known routes through. There aren't other routes. I mean, you say, okay, I'm not going to take the bus. Well, then what? You're going to walk through the mountains. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of that, a lot of complexity there that Mexico is having.
But these are known complexities, right? So is it just there's just not enough resources to manage it? That's at the different checkpoints.
I think there's I'll let David answer this, particularly for Mexico. I think there is a resource problem. That resource problem is not driven from the fact that we couldn't, if not solve it, we could really be doing a better job in a proactive way of managing migrant flows in the Western hemisphere. The problem I have is that a lot of the reason why it's not dealt with in a mature problem-solving way is politics. The border is this entity, this extremely important entity for this country and for Mexico, but at the same time, it is a political football. And as we get closer to election on both sides of the aisle, the conversations about what is happening at the border have reached, extreme levels of propaganda, and it will continue again on both sides. And so it's really approached with this simple kind of perspective of, hey, just put up a wall and everybody will stop coming, or, in reality, it's not true. And and the fact of the matter is that we humans don't generally like really complex problems that take, cooperation, right? Particularly right now in the political environment where it needs both sides of the aisle. It needs both countries. It needs real engagement on a really meritocratic kind of platform where, hey, we're just trying to, you're an expert and you're going to give us all your perspective. We're going to build a solution for this. That's not what's happening. Instead, again, we're having arguments about, putting a wall up for 2,000 miles and then expecting that to actually solve the problem. And so,
I mean, they'll just find,
into that, but
they'll find another way to go around the wall.
It's a simple, I've always looked at, with all my experience at the border, and to be clear, I spent a lot of time in Latin America. Also was Latin America was my beat for Stratfor as an analyst. And then David and I have worked together in Latin America for a very long time. And I don't know, David, what do you think about that? What do you about
it's as I mentioned, here we have a problem. The main problem that I see, it's corruption, right? So even if we have new administrations, a lot of times there's a lack of resources, but it's not because we don't have it at some point. It's because they are not utilizing them correctly, like in training of the people, the payment that the authorities receive, etc. So as I mentioned, there's, and you mentioned it, Tony, like always, if you implement a lot of security, you will have always porous borders, right? Always there's going to be people trying to take advantage of those type of matters, whatever it is. And that's the business, because if you put walls, they are going to jump the walls or get in through the walls or create tunnels to get
or come via container.
Exactly. So and they are going to charge the people for that, right? If it's more difficult, they're going to charge more. So I remember there was I don't recall the name of this guy. It's like a guy in the northern border. I think it's in Tijuana, or I'm not sure about it, but he's making TikToks on a daily basis, right? And always he's like just recording himself and one of his brothers just with a letter, right? Just putting the letter on the other side of the border and just jumping like that, like jumping and returning like a game. And they say, hey, nothing happens, right? Like you can do this all day, every day, and nothing is going to happen, right? And I'm not saying that there are a lot of spots that are already owned by criminal organizations. Everybody knows that, even if you are working in the field, right, on both sides of the border. So it's a matter of, I think it's a matter that it's a root, a problem in the root that needs to be changed, that needs to be faced with reality, because we are facing a lot of stuff and wanted to protect human rights and wanted to protect a lot of matters and the people and the development and the business. But at the end, we are not facing reality. And that's part of what's happening also on the tech side of things. So I think we need to, at some point, address the reality, face it, engage it, and create real solutions for this matter.
I guess, what prevents a country from just saying, hey, if you're having problems at your country, we got jobs here, instead of paying other organizations, whether criminal or nonprofit, here's the fee. You pay the fee. You hop on the plane. We're going to help you with that plane ticket, right? If you don't have the resources, but come over here and get a job.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think at root, the reality of the situation is this: it's supply and demand. It is basic capitalist principles, the most basic. There is a demand for labor in the United States, and there are pull dynamics, as we call them, and then push dynamics of people. Just take out the violence, the climate change, all of that. There are people, and these were the thing that I always recognize is that, particularly in the early 2000s and so on, the people that were willing to make this journey and knew the actual risks. They weren't naive. They were some of the bravest, most hardworking people who had huevos, who were going to make this trip to make their family's life better. And if you're a 23-year-old male and your mom is struggling and you have brothers and sisters and they need to go to school, it's almost like if you have any sort of honor, you're going to go and try to find a way to take care of your family. And so in a lot of ways, I feel like the only thing that really snuffs out migration flows is a depressed or collapsing U.S. economy. Because if there are jobs available, if there is even a notion of a better life, real people are going to take that choice. People that I really respect are going to make that choice. And so when you have that kind of reality of that, it's just supply and demand. How do you overcome that? I mean, and when you add on to it, the poly crises of the next 10 years, particularly in Latin America, collapsing economies or struggle with climate change or, Venezuela imploding or whatever is the push dynamic that is essentially violence, instability, and chaos driving people out, not just from Latin America. So as we've said, we're starting to see more and more flows from other countries that are just trying to make it to Mexico to come across or, wherever they can land, even making it in South America, being able to be accepted into a flight into Nicaragua, which you could argue is intentionally allowing people to platform for there and come to the United States. I think that's the reality we're talking about is, well, are people going to stop? Well, not if the economy is doing well. Well, okay, if people aren't going to stop. And in reality, as we move forward, it's all relative. So the U.S. economy could depress, but if you have Guatemala or any country, really heading toward breakdown, those able-bodied human beings are going to attempt to make a better life. And so that is the reality, and that's where we have to start from. Again, geographically, you can pass over it. You can cross it. Systematically, capitalism determines supply and demand. We're all about that. And as you said, we need hundreds of thousands of workers. There are Republicans and Democrats on both sides of the aisle who are recognizing, hey, we have 300,000 jobs in Alabama that we need filled. Somebody said, how do we? And so the real answer is, unfortunately, is that we're allowing an asylum system to be this massive funnel. So you have to step across the border into the United States, declare asylum, and then go through this process, when in reality, you just want to go work. And so
you just do a job board. Say, hey,
exactly. And
everybody has a lot of people have internet today, and I'm sure you can get an NGO to get a Starlink up in rural villages or whatnot. And
absolutely.
But that's too easy. It's too easy.
That's the thing. Even look, Colombia has a great guest worker program for Venezuela. It can be done. At this point, the only way to get into the United States is at a port of call. So people don't realize the changes that Biden made. You have to be at a port of call, and you have to have already scheduled an appointment through an app that you can then go and have a meeting to make your case for asylum. So if you get caught crossing the border nowadays in any other area besides a port of call where you have this interview, you are immediately expelled, and at this point now with penalties. And so we're letting an asylum system that is broken and overwhelmed and incapable, and yet we won't make changes politically to minimize that, even though there are routes forward. There are known, as you said, strategic and tactical decisions we can make and resource allocations we can make to improve it. And so that's a question. Why are we relying on this broken system that really is causing a lot of the issues we see on the border? And that's the question. Is this on purpose? Because, we get these great videos of all these people, this massive humanity trying to make it across the border, and it could be done in a much better way. So you have this kind of refugee route, an asylum route, but then most importantly, an economic route that is tied to actual demand. They say, hey, I need these workers. And then people with then that way they're in the system, they're tracked, we know where they are, we know what they're doing, and if they leave that situation, then we know we can go get them.
Yeah.
But if you have a
And
situation
they're paying
now,
taxes, right? It'll be a system where they can pay taxes.
Yeah,
No?
I think something people say they don't pay taxes. They got to remember they pay sales taxes, and so and they don't vote. And so one of the things politically right now is that they're going to vote, and they can't. You cannot vote without an ID. That is the law in the United States, and so that's one of those political statements. But yeah, they do pay taxes. They do pay in the system with regard to, if you take, for example, sales taxes or so forth. And so it's complex, but reality states they're not going to stop. We need them. I think that, just to that point, I think, demographically, I don't know if people realize this. I guess they do, because Elon Musk talks about it all the time now, but demographically, United States is below the rate of return in births.
Yeah.
So even from who's going to do the work? It's really going to come down to what? Robots or migrants, or both. And so, again, the reality is we need them. They want to come. We just don't have a mature system for intaking and applying them where everybody wants them. And do you
see this problem in do you guys see this problem in other advanced economies, like, let's say, Italy, Japan? Is it the same problem where they're trying to fight to get into Japan? And
no, not Japan.
Because they're a good textbook example of what happens when an economy's demographics don't play in its favors.
Roger. Yeah, that's a great exact. Japan, Germany, all these countries that actually have pretty strong, and Germany not as much, but they're having this backlash now. So they're getting really strong, kind of anti-immigration laws. Is that if they're under the rate of return of births demographically, then they are, questions like, are you going to be able to stand up an army in 10 years? Are you going to have enough, military age males and females who can do such a thing? So, but to answer your question, Europe has their own problems, and they are there's a lot of difference because Mexico and U.S., it is one it's easier and more realistic to look at as one geographic region with a line through it. Where Europe, the thing is, though, you got the European plane, you can drive a tank from Berlin to St. Petersburg or the other way. It's just a flat. And so you have a lot of places where people will cross, and but the U.S. is a country of immigrants, and there are more opportunities for immigrants. And so if you're an immigrant in Europe, you generally have a lot more difficulties with regard to social integration, finding work, that sort of thing. The U.S. is pretty practiced at integrating immigrants into the country, because we're not a genealogy. Like, right, if you're from Japan, you're Japanese. If you're from America or from the United States, you're not a United Statesian. We're all essentially, the U.S. is a contract we've all agreed to and said, give me your poor and we all came, and now we're this powerful nation from it. So immigration is really our strength. And at the same time, immigration is always going to destabilize societies. And it's there's always going to be fear that they're here to steal your jobs or what have you. And so there's no doubt it has to be managed in a really thoughtful way, which that's our point. It's not being. So there, in nowhere are we saying, in any way saying, hey, you got to just let everybody in. I mean, that's not realistic. And it's, but at the same time, how are we going to manage the reality that people are coming and we need them? And so, how do we do that? That is really the question at hand.
So David, how are you advising clients on the Mexico side, right, that perhaps are looking to establish presence in the U.S. as a business or whatnot, and then integrating that immigration issue?
Well,
Right?
for example, we always it's all about strategies when creating or when clients, for example, new clients or new transnational companies are willing to start business here in Mexico. Not only for example, for the people they are going to hire, but what they are going to face, right? So the advice is always to create these scenarios and this protection for them, like screening processes, background checks, etc., so they can know who they are hiring. Because we have one problem. If, for example, if we have certain numbers from the Migration Institute for the people that it's coming to Mexico or is just in transit to the U.S., but it's similar to the criminal figures that we face here in Mexico. The numbers are not up to date, right? And to be honest, we don't know specifically how much people in for real it's here, right? Like a lot of people are illegals. So if I'm talking about the southern border of Mexico, it has a lot of lack of security and of processes and of strategies and resources. We are talking about that we are only counting certain people that it's entering the country. So right now, for example, if we are facing lack of jobs for the Mexicans here in Mexico, it's a problem to have more people trying to get jobs here, right, from other countries. It's not the same as in the U.S. So whenever a business or a transnational company is willing to start or integrate business here, for example, right now with nearshoring and all those type of matters, they look for more professionalism and expertise, right? So we tell our clients it's you need to know who you are hiring, right? And those the other part is that illegal workers, they are the only way to get through and to make some money here. It's working, for example, in the maquilas or in certain works or in certain places that they abuse of them, right? Because they know about their situation, their illegal situation, so they don't care. They pay lower salaries. They don't have insurance, health insurance, or they are just a number. They are not like uploaded into a system because they are legal. So it's part of the abuse that they face. So a lot of companies and our clients, when they are willing to establish their business here in Mexico, for example, it's all about creating the protocols and the strategies to hire the correct people, right? And I'm not saying that the immigrants are people that are not good people, right? But it's always uncertainty on who you are hiring.
Mm-hmm.
And Tony, really quickly, that's exactly the same advice we would give the U.S. government or the Mexican government at their border, is that the whole issue, and technology is going to play a big role in this, but the question is we have to be able to quickly and effectively determine who this person is, background, probabilities for committing crime, that sort of thing. And we can be really conservative about it. It's just like, questions like when you're trying to get a, citizenship, you could even say, do you use drugs? Whatever, you can make it really even conservative / draconian with regard to, hey, in order to get in this country, you have to have a skill we need, and then there is a route forward. And then if you are coming across the border without those things, then you can have more strict security measures. More, absolutely not. You're going back to Mexico. You're going back to your country of origin, and you're not allowed to come back for 5 years. That sort of thing. Like those. That's when the kind of like carrot and stick of border control can really play a part. It doesn't mean that you're going to stop all of the flows of illegal immigrants. Hey, we have a 2,000-mile border, most of it through desert. Response is very difficult. And we'll get into that with the problem with technology, but it's not, if we were really going to hermetically seal the border, it's not one wall. It's 2 or 3 walls. It is standoff zones where you have machine gun nests that are, not allowing people to cross. Like you have to cross
drones.
And hey, I'm not saying that there's not a future where that becomes at least possible. I don't know if I want to go with necessary, but at least possible. I think that's the thing is like, if we hermetically seal the border, what does that do to these massive economies, these flows of economies, and these ideas that at the same time we want to separate ourselves, decouple ourselves from China, from Asia, right? Well, where's that going? Well, it's going to Mexico. And so we're gonna lock down the border like in Tijuana, where like Mexican truckers can't get across, or actually I think that was in El Paso, where state of Texas. We really made it difficult for supply to continue, and that's truncating real economic power there. I mean, a border is about making money. Things get fluid. There's opportunities everywhere. So it draws all types. That's the thing about borders. But again, we have this 2,000-mile border. We do have to secure it, whatever that means. We have to define what securing it means. We have to define a clear route to coming to this country and a clear route for getting thrown out of this country. And then really do a great job of really driving the information to these countries to overwhelm the propaganda they're getting on TikTok that they can come to America no problem and have massive success and so forth. So it's really, really important to remember, just how necessary that flow is. But it again, to David's point, you have to know who you're dealing with, and that's the key as far as we're concerned.
So how do you see technology playing into this?
Right? I'll say first, I'll let David. I think the main thing is technology, like whether you're talking about walls, smart walls, sensor plates. The question is, because it's a 2,000-mile border, what's the response element? So you see someone, a group of 3 people in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, they're crossing the border at 2 a.m. What do you send in a crack team of operators in a helicopter for 3 people, that sort of thing. So what I'll say is that in future iterations, I personally believe that the response question has to be handled. And does that get handled through drones, through automated, what are those drones capabilities? Do they have tasing capabilities? Are we arming them? So a lot of questions, but I think that it is a complex, as everything on the border is, a complex question, but absolutely technology, in my view, will play a significant role.
Yeah, especially if, to what you said earlier, the birth rate is a negative return right now. So it's like, who's going to police these people?
Yep.
Right.
I mean, a lot of just to answer that question, exactly where do the Border Patrol come from? And then the more and more we militarize a border, if that's what happens, then that has its own, a lot of its negative effects on economic progress. But anyway, I think David has a lot of points about technology, so I'll let him talk. But
so it's a vast topic, I think. So. In technology, and I think it's related to all the systems. I think all the systems are changing, and we as humans are always trying to be prepared for something, right? But we cannot. Sometimes we are not real to ourselves that the problem is already here, right? It's not like we need to create laws, protocols, etc. So it's already here. We live that with the pandemic. So I think right now, for example, with artificial intelligence, analytics, heat detectors, a lot of matters can be done, right, with the correct investment, with the correct people, because it's not about that. For example, with artificial intelligence, it's not about like we are not going to get more human force, right? It's more like reducing the human force for more specialization and just leaving technology to do its own, right? So it's just minimizing the workforce, and also it can also reduces the corruption, right? And you are leaving in more trained hands the decisions with the support of technology. So at the end, I think it's an talking from the Mexican side, I think always it's about collaboration, right? But it's about real collaboration. What's on your side, what's on our side, because to be honest, like you guys have a CBP, right? Like a very specialized team for the border. We are changing constantly from administration to administration the police force. We used to have the federal police that, from my perspective, it was a very good force. Like they were trained, they were professionals, they were not like just trying to fit, right? They were very well trained professionals. But then we changed from administration and we have another name, right? Like Gendarmería. Right now we have the National Guard, and we don't have like a continuous name, right? Even the backup for the forces. So that's for me that's a concern, right? I don't see like a strategy right now in my country.
Why is that? I mean, as big as Mexico is, why is that an issue?
Well, it's an issue because, to be honest, I don't see right now. We are about to change administration, and I don't see a security strategy.
Big shout out and a huge thank you to Zeakin for making this happen. They have an amazing platform. Check out their website, zeakin.com, zeacon.com.
Like, it's not there, right?
Is it because like corruption is just
yeah,
and, part of my ignorance, but is it because the institution that's been at play with the cartel and corruption is that just so big that there's no way around it?
Yeah, for example, right now you have the militaries all over the place, like just responsible of a lot of tasks that are not for militaries, are more for police, for law enforcement, right? So in the civilian intelligence side of things, we have militaries. In the law enforcement, we have militaries. So you can't have the militaries doing all the stuff all over the place. You need specialized units, intelligence units. It's civilian intelligence, military intelligence, and police intelligence. We don't have that. Right now we have military intelligence. That's all. Like they are all over the place because it's part of the political game that right now the actual administration is playing, like since the beginning. So that's something that, from my perspective, it's always about the border, but it's always about collaboration, true collaboration. What do you have? And we used to have Initiative Merida. It was a plan that the U.S. gave resources to Mexico to train their agents, to buy tools, technology, etc. And it's still there with another name. But from my perspective, it's all about corruption. To be honest, it's about corruption, and it's also about facing reality. Because technology is already there. If we are waiting, of course it's needed, like law reforms, like just to fill the gaps, right? But at some point you need to face reality because it's hitting in our faces. And a lot of people is not taking into account that this is happening right now. And it's not only security matters, it's also weather inclemencies, it's also health impacts. It's a lot of stuff ongoing here. So at some point, it's just to be real. The reality is not going to be good. The people is going to get out of their comfort zone, and people doesn't like that. So at the end, talking about these situations, it's like I was talking to Colby. It's like science fiction. But to be honest, like George Orwell, all those books that we used to read, like it's getting real. It's not dumb. It's getting real. So we are getting there, and from my perspective, we are not prepared.
I think to his point, what we've made a few times is that the problem is we have this very complex issue that no one is cooperating on. I mean, you have Democrats and Republicans that refuse to work together to solve the problem. Kind of the weaponization of the propaganda, about whether or not this is an invasion that will destroy the country. You're telling me the most powerful nation in the world is going to be destroyed by a few 100,000 migrants? I think that's probably a little bit hyperbolic. And so how do we really, because again, it's become this wedge issue for the election. And I don't see that changing for the next year. Nothing we're talking about. It's very, very unlikely that there's going to be rational discussions amongst, our own national leaders, and hopefully business leaders can really be the calming voice here, because they can't handle the military and the political side, but they can speak to the economic issues, particularly when they're being told, or being pressured, to get out of China, and it becomes more difficult to work in China. Let alone having, points of contact in the United States that can work with Mexican leadership, because they've got their shit together. And we're now talking about and then to their southern border, and recognizing Mexico's issues with regard to their struggles, and Guatemala and so forth and on down.
Well, then now you have like Ecuador with their issues.
Exactly. Right. And so you end up with
how many more Ecuadorians are going to be crossing that border to get over here?
It's a perfect example of it. Right. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, it's a perfect example. The border is, along with whether it's a climate crisis or unsticking geopolitical conflict, is that, for us, we lived most of our lives. I was born in 1975, most of our lives in the best period of human history, modern, it really was. And we'll look back on it like that. I truly believe that, as far as from economic inclusivity, from violence, that sort of thing. And so we lived in this golden age, and now we're kind of moving back toward the mean of human history, where it becomes more complex. And at the same time, now we're facing these existential problems like massive, migration flows as people move away from the other crises, or, when AI starts to take jobs. And so that increases more of the flows. And so it's like climate change. It's like existential problems like nuclear proliferation. It's the question that David and I are asking is like, how is this world, with the current situation, how are we going to get together and really face these existential problems that we're facing that have massive outcomes, will have massive outcomes for all of us. And yet we can't even agree about some of the more simplistic aspects of the issue. We're trying to argue whether climate change is real or not. I don't think that's as much of an argument anymore, but it's still, I've heard it recently. So how do we, or if it is, and if it isn't real, let's have an honest discussion as a country to challenge that, and then a globe. So yeah, it's a concern that we are breaking apart from a global perspective. Our decision, we're getting farther apart. We're starting to look after our own national interests, our own interests specifically, and we're not capable, frankly, of handling existential crises or even major strategic crises like borders.
You see it locally here in the U.S., where somebody might want to get out of Seattle because of the politics and move to another state like Texas, Florida, whatever. So it's happening not only on the global scale, but even on a local, right? Where there's no jobs in certain areas, so that person's going to go drive across the country and go find a job elsewhere.
Yeah, I just read an article today. I don't remember where, but it was talking about how, as for example, the Eastern Seaboard or New Orleans starts to face more and more flooding, and as sea levels rise, well, then the expectation is that, and you saw this in Hurricane Katrina, the young people leave. Yeah. They go to find safety and work. Who stays are old people who either won't leave or can't leave. And as that cycles through time, who's doing the work?
Yeah.
Who's, driving?
Because you still need New Orleans, right? It's a big major port.
It's one of the most important ports around, deep water ports around. And so exactly, this is migration flows. We're going to have to deal with migration flows for all number of reasons, internally and externally. The point being, many, many people over the next decades are going to move. How are we going to maintain, really nationhood in some states? I mean, in some, not states like state, but in some situations where, you know, if everybody from Venezuela decides to come to Texas, we're going to have a problem. And so how do we, right now, today, how do we start to deal with the problem now? Because yes, in my view and in our view, analytically, this problem is not going to decrease. The problem being movements of people without any real system for managing that movement. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And David, what's your take on like just what's going on locally in Mexico from that standpoint of migration, like within the country?
So yeah, it's similar. Here it's more about job opportunities also, but a lot of violence. For example, there are certain parts of the northeast of the country that are facing violence due to criminal organizations on a daily basis. So people even go to the US or just move inside the country, like just migrate inside the country to other southern states. So it's similar to that. Like it's job opportunities, violence. I think both of them are the most interesting ones to mention.
Yeah, I think it's like understanding that, you know, push dynamics or pull dynamics, they're the same no matter, you know, where you're talking about. So those things that push people to move are whether it's move from one state to another state inside the United States or to move countries, you know, it's always going to be those same reasons, you know, job scarcity, substandard level of living, famine, drought, political or religious persecution, you know, even pollution, natural disasters. So like natural disasters, we can't really predict, you know, so you could have these massive spikes in influx, both internally and externally. It's those, the factors. It's almost like I'd ask a person, you know, with a family, what would make you go 2,000 miles across some of the harshest terrain you could imagine through at least 6 different cartels or criminal organizations, you know, pick 6 and then cross a border and then go into a situation where you're illegal. And so you have no rights and you're, you know, all of that. What would cause you to do that? And I think that question for every human being is the same. Well, if I thought I was going to die, if I thought my family was going to die, if I didn't think there were any opportunities for my children, I'd give it a shot. I'm going to die here.
Yeah. With no opportunity.
Yeah.
So it's like, hey, you got nothing to lose.
It's really simple. I think people have this kind of, it's like, no, the people that take a 2,000-mile journey to the United States to go work in a, you know, a maquiladora or you know, any sort of picking tomatoes for 10 cents an hour, that means that was a better reality than what they had.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah,
so,
I don't think
they didn't come here for the sun. They didn't come here for the vacation.
From that point, right? They just see it as, oh, this person just came here and stealing our jobs.
And look, that's important to listen to. Again, historically, you know, find a place in history where X population moved into Y's, you know, area in their hood, and it didn't start beef. That's why it has to be clear. Everybody knows what's happening, you know, so you don't get an influx of 30,000 migrants to one place because they all thought they had a job and there isn't jobs and now they're there. Like, you know, everybody like going to New York. It's not just the governor of Texas sending them to New York. New York typically has great abilities, and this makes sense, you know, New York, in ability to accept refugees and asylum, to, you know, services. And so humanitarian organizations would send people to New York. And so now that was cool for a minute. And now you're getting more and more stacked on top of them, and there's no infrastructure. And so it's not just that they're there, it's that they're there. You know, the other day, kids in a Brooklyn school had to move so they could be placed there. So they were sent home from school. Now the parents don't want to send their kids back. That's how you create friction between an immigrant population and the existing population. And it's not necessarily about race. I mean, you know, genetically, those people in one area are Latinos, they're Mexican, and they do not want other Mexicans coming in and competing with them for the same jobs. Now, at the same time, we as Americans need to be realistic about what jobs, and there are two tiers. There's both obviously the informal work and the labor, and then kind of the high functioning
labor, yeah.
That's what they so. But it's like for the low level, I'm forgetting the term right now, but that drive of migration and like those opportunities, they're just, it's impossible to not believe that someone who wants that job, because as I was getting to, we don't really want it. There's 300,000 agricultural jobs available in multiple states, for example. It's like, who's going to do that work? And so the owners are like, well, migrants do that work for what we can pay. We want migrants to come in and do that work because we can't find Americans to do it. And so that's once more to that question of reality. And if we can deal with that, and at the same time, the guys like the technologists like Elon Musk, we need to create some sort of ability, because, hey, one of our greatest strengths is that we brain drain everybody else. So the best and the brightest come to this country, and they make this country more dynamic and more capable. Yeah. And whether we like it or not, that again is going to continue. And I think that's where questions of, what are we really arguing about here? I mean, is it because we don't, white people don't want to be the minority in their country? And so I'm sorry, man, but that's written in the cards. I mean, that's going to happen. And so how do we deal with that reality and understand that this country is going to change? And at the same time, that's what this country does. And that's what's so amazing about this place, is that we're young and we evolve, and we have to find a way to recognize the problems here, remove our biases up into including racism, and really make conscientious decisions about what's going to keep this country the strongest country in the world and what's going to drive that. And I personally believe it's what's always driven it. It is immigrant classes that, again, people who are willing to go 2,000 miles are the people generally that you want.
Yeah.
Minus the people who went 2,000 miles because they're running from the bad things they did. And then those are the people we want to stop and handle. So.
And that's even tough in itself, because it's like David was saying, there's no record. There's no good record keeping of, is this guy a bad person or not?
Yeah, I think, to that point, I think that's something that was lost in Title 42, is that a lot of people in Title 42, yes, we were expelling them right away, but they became pretty clear really quickly. No one was taking down their name. Yeah. So you got kicked out, but you could just try again.
Like,
and so, yes,
numbers your name. It's like, what was it?
Yeah, no, like, okay, what'd you say your name was? Jorge, okay, vaya con Dios. And it's like, see you tomorrow. And so people, you talk about Title 42 doing it really didn't. We need to be able to intake, assess, and then make decisions. And you put these people, the interviewers, and like whether or not it's an asylum or not, it's like that in the United States is a very narrow determination. And so people are trying to fit into this. It's the only way in is through the asylum program. And it's this very narrow chute. And so when they get denied, well, they just walk 2,000 miles. They're going to the desert. And that's not what we as a country want. We want them to be, we want to track them. We want to know where they are. We want to know what they're doing. And that's our right. And I think any nation, cohesive entity, organization, whether it's a company or not, they have the right to know who they're hiring. They have the right to know what they're doing in certain respects. And as a nation, we have a higher threshold for that, because, we don't want to get attacked or destabilized, from externals. And because last thing, you can't invade the United States very easily. And so, from a military perspective. And so how do you create destabilization? And I understand, and we understand, the border is a topic of concern in that way. Yeah. And so these are the kind of
you break a nation from within.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that keeps coming up in my head, David, is there a solution to that, to the violence? I mean, what's got to change, do you think? Because that's a huge problem, isn't it? That's a huge problem for also people that want to do business in Mexico, especially with all the border towns and the more with mirror shoring or near shoring. I mean, that's got to play a factor in, like, where do you build a factory and who controls the town of the factory and whatnot. And really, it just comes to, we just want to build a factory.
Yeah. So I think like the violence, it's there are strategies and situations where it can be reduced. So, for example, criminal organizations, not only in Mexico, from my perspective, that's an issue that it's a historical issue also, but it's not, as I was mentioning at the beginning of the conversation, it's not only that these guys are involved in drug trafficking or human trafficking. Right now they are trying to find ways, even with companies, with official companies, like to money laundering, to invest and reinvest their assets, and they are taking risks in other types of business. Like it's like they are businessmen. They are businessmen. We need to understand that. So at some point they have reached levels of politicians, of a country power, right? So I don't think it's a way out of this matter of criminal organizations. I think it's a way out to reduce violence, and that's just dealing with less cartels rather than to deal with a lot of criminal cells. Because right now you have, like in the past, we used to have like 6-9 cartels, right? So then they start to split in several criminal organizations, armed wings, hitmen, and a lot of the towns right now in Mexico, they have a lot of criminal organizations. So they don't even know what the name is, right? So they are very violent. They are willing to have this life of success, of money, of girls, of power. And there's a saying here in Mexico: it's better to live 5 years as a king rather than to live the whole life as a poor guy, right? So they prefer that because they're the kids here and the young men are lacking of opportunities. So the media and all the communications right now, and that's happening in all the world. Like people right now, they know what is going out there just with a cell phone, So it's not like we don't have a chance to live a good life. It's like, wow, why they can live that life and we cannot live that life. So they prefer to engage with people that is going to pay them, that is going to take care of their family, rather than to be poor all their lives. So I think just it's about, and it's the real stuff. You need to at some point negotiate, right? Negotiate, and you are not going to get rid of them, but it's about getting the violence at a lower levels.
I'd like to answer it. I'm going to tell a story about that kind of fits this point about how to reduce violence. And so this is where facing reality and some really tough questions. And I want to say up front, I'm not saying working with criminal organizations is the way, or that, corruption is the system you're dealing with. And so that's the system you have to play into. However, reality. So David and I worked a project. I won't say the industry, but a global national was really interested in going to put their workforce or factory in one of 6 states or so. I think it was 6. And so they had us run the analysis. And so we came back and we picked a state. We said, hey, go to this. This is the better state. And this is why so forth. And they came back and they were mad. They were like, we did our own internal and we say this state because look, the crime levels are low. And so, yes, we talked to them about how you can't really trust statistics and so on, but they're making arguments. And then we're on the call and David says, well, yeah, that's because that state is entirely run by criminal organizations and they suppress the violence.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to be paying them 30% of everything you make because they run everything. There is no way out of it. There's no outside the corruption. So you have to make this choice. Are you going to deal with a corrupt power entity that is controlling this state? Or are you going to say we're going to, go somewhere else that's not controlled by a cartel, but it's more violent because they're all fighting over the same plaza or they're all fighting over the same business streams. So it really drives home the point of it's very complex, and this idea that like there are two kind of misnomers is like the cartel, it's all about violence. It's 90% hitmen. It's like, no, dude, their CFO went to Harvard, right?
Yeah.
Their CTO, and he's a CTO, he went to MIT. It is a professional global organization that runs exactly like a global national would, except for if you steal their shit, they will kill you. Or
right.
So
it's a way for them to protect market share.
Hey, as you said, live as a king. High value. You run this product for us. You don't ask any questions about what that product was. It may be a kid. It may be cocaine. It might be a gun. Not our problem. You run that. We'll pay you more money in a day than you could ever make in a year. But if you screw up, that's the end of you. If you screw up bad enough, that's the end of everyone you care about. And that's the contract that everyone understands. And so now when you have these kind of business entities that you call the cartel, and then really they're just using 1099 type contractors. All these other criminal organizations are like, okay, I'm going to contract this group and then this group and then this group and that group. So when you're describing a cartel, like even the Sinaloa cartel, you say, oh, that was El Chapo. It's like, no. That area, Sinaloa, geographically has produced outlaws for 1,000 years, man. And they still produce outlaws. Those mountains of the Sierra Madre still produce outlaws. And now you call them the Sinaloa cartel. But historically, they're just doing what they've always done. And I think those it's where the conceptualization on this side of the border is completely incorrect. And so that'll allow a Mexican organization to be like, well, they're in Venezuela or they're in Europe or they're just like any global national. They're looking to expand their market. They make deals with like-minded businessmen on the other side of whatever border there is. And then they go to solving problems. And so when you have something like the border, you have really smart, educated professionals who are tasked with, hey, how do you get over a fence? They'll figure it out. And then also understanding that 90% of all counterfeit goods, all illicit goods, piggyback on licit infrastructure. So it's again very complex, and the violence and the criminal organizations, like the U.S. policy of cutting off the head of the chicken, right? Cutting off the head of the organization, going after VIPs. The problem is that creates violence as they fight over what's left.
Right,
is the answer to
who's going to take over?
Yeah. And then the question for Mexico is, are we going to let a supranational entity become as powerful as us? And so,
it's really complex.
It's very complex. It's very complex. And so, Mexico has either this idea they're going to be co-opted by the business, just like the U.S. could get co-opted by tech leaders, or are they going to combat that? And if they're going to combat that, that's going to increase violence. And if that increases violence, that's bad for business. So then the question comes back around. So should you do a deal with the head of the cartel? Those are realistic decisions that have to be made. And there are no easy answers. And again, I'm not supporting dealing with, being corrupt or, it's just, again, though, the reality. If you want to move product, are you going to negotiate with the people who control the infrastructure? Those people work for a criminal organization. How are you going to navigate that and not end up in jail yourself, right? Which is a lot of what we do. David and I are like, you can't do that. It's against the law, so it is highly complex. David, do you have some to add to that?
And it's as easy as so a member, a drug lord, they say, okay, I'm a member of a cartel. I'm the drug lord of this or that cartel. So I'm here, right? So this is my business. This is what I do. But for example, in the case of Mexico, and that's the voice of the people, right? Not like mine. Like they said, okay, but politicians are the same. They are stealing our money. They are killing our people. They are doing this and that. So what's the difference? The difference is that you are being an hypocrite and you are just saying what you are, like the reality. And that's what we are talking about. Like to face the real issues, you need to have real conversations about it. Because a lot of times people said, oh no, why did you mention that? Like it's out of bounds. No. It's a reality. Like let's speak reality if we want to face problems and we want to address the issues that we are facing on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. David's right. Yeah, it's like I am a criminal. You're going to pay me 20% of what you owe, or I'm going to do you. Where the government is not as direct, not as honest, and so in a lot of ways
they're going to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Different methods.
Yeah. And so really, as we're talking about, who can provide security? And if a guy that calls himself a cartel head has reduced street violence by 99%, that's who the people are going to support, because reality.
Which is like a lot of the tourist districts, which you keep hearing about that, the cartel controls the tourist districts because they like the money coming in, right? So
a highly diverse portfolio of business opportunities. That is what a cartel does. How can we make money? And that's right. I saw it quite a bit. Like, you don't want to screw with their money. That is for sure. And I think like, the holiday locate like Cancun or somewhere, you'll still have incidents. So what happens? The military gets deployed, right?
Yeah.
They'll mess with the money, or the cartels will handle it. And so it's when you have a destabilized order, hierarchical order, who's controlling this plaza, who controls the beach, whatever. That's when you can see a lot of conflict and violence, where if there's one leader and he's got it on lockdown, there's nobody getting shot on the beach. Yeah. And so it is, again, the destabilizing nature of the U.S. foreign policy of we want to destabilize these criminal organizations, keep them on their toes. We don't want those in Mexico too. We don't want these organizations to come to be able to challenge our own power. But on the other hand, we are perpetuating the violence if we keep arresting the leaders, because people are going to fight over the scraps, or more than the scraps, the nut. And that's business. And that's how they look at it. It's just business. Oh, we can take advantage of this plaza that just opened up. We want to do it. Yeah, let's go. Business decisions, Yeah,
it's kind of interesting that, a lot of people sensationalize the violence in Mexico, but there's a shit ton of violence here. And it's crazy, right? But for over here, there's no real rhyme or reason, but it all comes down to opportunity, right? People just want access to a job, or the ability to get food. So they don't have money for food, they go rob the Target, or they go rob, walk out of Nordstrom with a bunch of clothes to go resell on Amazon.
Yep. And once Maslow's needs are taken care of, you want a Porsche. You want, I mean, it's the capitalist dream. That's the whole point, is that those guys are puro capitalists. They're like, I've made it. I've paid for my mom for the next 10 years. I want a girlfriend and I want a life. And again, and a lot of that, of course, is romanticized. I mean, it's the outlaw life, and that gets romanticized. And it's all, again, very complex, very complex issues.
And the problem also is that you have a lot of these people that are used to survive, like not to live, like to survive on a daily basis. Fight for food, for example, in Brazil, in the favelas, in the poor neighborhoods, like they are always fighting. They see their parents fighting all the time. If they have parents, they need to fight for food, right? So I remember an interview, I think it was in 2007, from a drug lord in Brazil named Marcola. So this guy is a member of PCC. It's Primero Comando do Capital in Brazil. So this guy was like saying to this TV show that they read a lot in prison because Primero Comando Capital have a lot of networks in prison. That's the main area of operation, prisons. So they were saying, okay, I read like in my whole life like 1,000 books. I never went to school, but he mentioned something that blows my mind in that time. Like there's a rare breeding that is having bird on a daily basis, trying to survive in the streets, fighting for the food, and that rare breeding is coming for everybody. Like they are not going to stay there; they are going to try to survive, and whatever it takes, they are going to do it. If they need to kill, they are going to do it. If they need to walk, if they need to move, if they need to migrate, they are going to do it. They don't care. They are already dead for themselves. So imagine that if we have a growing mass of people without opportunities, not only in Mexico, in other places, what is going to happen? Like they are expedite, they are quick, they don't have bureaucracy, they have resources, they have firepower, and they have knowledge, and they have a lot of people willing to survive. So that's a concern right there.
Yeah, I mean, in my work, particularly, specifically, I worked with gangs in Guatemala and Honduras, and whether that was Mara Salvatrucha or MS-13 or Barrio 18 or the Cohetes, which was a strong gang in certain places in Guatemala, the Rockets, they call themselves the Rockets. I think I've told this story a lot, or I've stated this a lot, is like when you want to do so, for example, for us, if like they, UNIDO, United Nations or whoever wanted to take medicine up into or build a school, or they had to, part of what I did was negotiate, hey, can we pass through your territory? And, this is what it'll look like and what would that take? And, that sort of thing. And I always say, like, first of all, it's shocking sometimes you find the head of a gang, a 16-year-old kid,
Wow.
And secondly, I was always really taken aback by just how smart and capable, like they may, particularly the older ones, if they didn't have any educational background, because they didn't, but they're those guys that recognized or had the capacity to learn. And so, they want to talk philosophy or so forth, but at the same time, they run this extremely violent gang, and they say the same things to Vita. This is what I was born into. And not you have people that join gangs that just, they have two parents and it's not all about survival. But overall, most of the guys I came in contact with and worked with were just, again, trying to get out of the hole that they felt they were born into, and decided to do it themselves in any way that they could. And whether that's
they just needed basic needs and whatnot. Yeah. Have you guys seen the movie Sound of Freedom?
I haven't. No, I haven't.
Not yet.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see what you guys' thoughts are on that movie. Because it seemed like all that just happened recently. But to what you said, right? There's a scene there that I actually thought of you. Yeah, going through all the jungles and whatnot. And it came down to just negotiating with the jungle lord, right? And
at the end of the day,
something as simple as like, hey, we have medicine for you. We need to get this to your people.
Yep. Everything. Everything is like that. Who controls the territory? So if I was a fixer for Doctors Without Borders and you wanted to go into a neighborhood and set up shop in a school to see everybody you could, you better have made a deal. You better have negotiated that, given a heads up. I watched, I'm not going to say whose it was. I watched U.S. national entity, or really, no, global entity organizations, I'll just say United Nations. I saw them get their trucks pushed off into a cliff because they didn't have the right, papeles to pass. Wow. And the guys running the border, they didn't give a damn what symbol was on the door. They had an order. Nobody passes this road without a ghetto pass. And if they do, you push their car into the ravine.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about. It's like, you're negotiating with someone you could argue as a criminal element, but really you're negotiating the mayor of the town. He may be 16, but he runs this place. Or you're negotiating to the actual power structure. So the government can't tell you whether or not you can build a school in their territory, but that guy can. And, I think particularly as younger, I mean, it was very clear to me that was just the reality. And it was scary, but there is no option. If you want to do the work, if you want to really even do the quality development work, you have to deal with the organizations that are actually controlling the ground. And a lot of times those are criminal organizations. So,
yeah, that's wild, man.
Yeah.
How do you guys sleep at night?
Who says we sleep? I think your adrenaline, you finally get, overloaded with adrenaline and cortisol, and you either die or you sleep. I think that's
do enough jujitsu and
that's right. David is one of the most knowledgeable and probably just the chillest guys I know in this kind of work. He has a realist perspective that I really appreciate, that I try to live with, which is, although it is anxiety making, I want to know the truth. I want to know the truth as best I can by challenging my own biases. And that's what is valuable for me, and as a person, let alone in my profession. And so I think that's the question we all have to ask ourselves. Do you want to keep ostriching? You want to keep living, you want to believe what you believe and only listen to sources of information that support your confirmation bias? Or do you want to be challenged with ideas, and so that we can actually solve problems that are facing us as organizations, nationally, and then again, globally? And the answer is, most people do not want to really face the realities on the ground and have conversations about, the things that we're discussing here. It's a non-starter to have a conversation with any organization about, okay, who's here, this person is really controlling the ground. And this is what they can't. And I understand that. But again, that's not dealing with reality. So it's a struggle for us. And
I'm sure it's a struggle for organizations, because they think that, we just set up shop and we start business. If the governor says yes, well, then we go.
Yeah.
Right. Or we get a business license and we go.
We build a factory right outside of favela, and it takes guys like David and I to look at a map and be like, you realize there's one way in and out of that area, that a favela, it goes through a favela. So that means they control that entry and exit, and you're going to put it where? And you're not
going to call the cops to get them off.
No, we were told by the governor or the mayor that this was the best. We had a real estate guy, and I bet he did. It's these questions that we don't ask ourselves. Like, you in America, yes, you look at bad neighborhoods and good, but you may not recognize, you drive 3 miles and all of a sudden you're going through a favela and there is no other way in and out. These kind of questions don't get asked as much as you think. But at the same time, it's incredible how much global national organizations, how much risk they have to manage, and just how many questions they have to ask in order to operate in a lot of these environments. Now, the point is, it's not going to get easier. It's getting more complicated and more difficult from here.
And you guys are doing a lot of work right now with sourcing, right? And helping those people find the right sources of whatever inputs they need for the final product.
Yeah, that's part of our business. Yeah. A lot of questions we're answering. Again, I think we talked about this in the last part. Is like, I want to move my factory to Mexico. I'm tired of being in China or Bangladesh or wherever. And kind of the recognition that you simply can't for the cost point that you want to maintain, or, you want to be in Tijuana, but you don't have any local understanding, knowledge, or capacity. And so you have a lot of work to do. So a lot of it within the nature of managing risk, but sometimes not just directly. Can you source this for me from a trusted source? And, building those trust relationships that are so important right now, because as the globalization, as it, I'm not willing to go as far as my former colleague Peter Zeihan and say collapse, but I think that's more of a time scale. He's like, it's going to happen today, and I'm like, it's probably going to happen, but over time. But we are, without a doubt, seeing a breakdown in this idea of a globalized entity, this globalized economic world, and so that is going to create a tremendous amount of change on its own. Just the reordering of everything from supply chains to economic flows to people flows to what have you. So
I watch a lot of Peter Zeihan, and I'm like, wow, like, do I just stop working and
I really think everyone should
go sleep under a coconut tree and just relax and watch the world unfold?
I think Peter, and again, I worked with him at Stratfor, and I'm not big on the predictive. I'm not big on making predictions. I can talk probabilities, but I'm not a predictor. I'm not going to say this is what's going to happen. I think what Peter's saying is, without a doubt, because my challenge is always like what Peter says, and then there is human agency, which I give a lot of power to, and there's technology, which is driven by human agency, and technology can overcome geography with tremendous effort. But overall, the questions he's asking and the challenges he's making to our current system of globalization. I mean, Peter's the first guy I heard bring up demographics, in 2010, and really have a great argument even then for what was going to occur. And so I just want to say, like, when it's a time frame thing, this is going to happen the next year, the next 2 years, I'm not about it. But with regard to the fundamentals of what he's saying in his book, it is coming. It's here. It's happening. And he's pointing it out. Yeah, right. He's pointing. So I think he's one of those guys that absolutely, if you're a thinker and a problem solver, I'll plug him right away. He's definitely someone you need to consider. And then as a red team challenge to that, say, okay, now what can we do as humans, as organizations, as decision makers? What can we do to mitigate the effects of what he is discussing? And because it's, at the end of the day, it's all made up. It's our choices. How do we want to order this world? How do we want to order our economies and that sort of thing? So I feel like he is doing a great job of bringing, and you can hear him, other people be so incredulous, particularly, he's been saying this for over a decade. And so people have been doubting him, for a while, and
things are coming to fruition.
Yeah. I have a lot of respect for the guys I work with. Whether it was Friedman, I think everybody, Friedman. And it's interesting. I worked there when, geopolitics were like, end of democracy. The world is solved, or not end of democracy, but, end of really the necessity for geopolitics. Their democracy not solved, but democracy is now the political platform that we will all move to, the end of history, in Fukuyama's words. And now geopolitics is becoming more and more important again. It's so interesting from my perspective to have spent a few years there, really heard a lot of the poo-pooing and the challenging of like this foundation of thought. And then as you move through time, and now it's probably one of the most relevant disciplines for decision makers to get into is geopolitics.
Yeah.
Are the meta, these macro scale movements, inertia that we all need to understand, whether that's demographics or how geography informs populations and so forth. So, yeah, absolutely.
Well, we can continue. We can talk for days. I mean, I'd love to have you guys back on the show
anytime
for other topics. David, would love to have you on the show, just kind of get your origin story and how you became who you are right now.
Of course.
How you became the David we all know and love. Yeah.
And then we'll take Colby out and
definitely
see if we can choke him out.
Wait.
Just so he can get a word in edgewise. Let's be clear. He won't shut up. Honestly. I mean, listen. So again, I think David is one of those guys that I really rely on. I just love to hear his perspectives.
Yeah.
As a Mexican and as
because all we hear is our side, right?
Yep.
Like, so I thought it was very valuable to hear what your thoughts are, and and
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more.
Absolutely. Appreciate you, man.
Anytime, guys. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, hey, thanks for coming on the show, and look forward to seeing you guys soon.
All right, brother. Love y'all both.
All
Y'all
right.
take care. See you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Thank you for tuning into the show. If you found value in what our guests shared and what we share on the show, please feel free to share with your friends and family. We'd love to see you back here. Thank you again. And you can find us on pretty much every social media channel, YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify as well. Thank you for watching. Thank you for tuning in. Step into the unscripted arena.